my topic for today ended up turning out to be more relevant to designing a Hypermedia API. And when I mean designing, we're kind of introducing the subject of Hypermedia APIs, and then we're going to be going into more details obviously there. But then most importantly, for the group, we're going to also show how we can be implementing one in Rails, because that is important. So, I'm going to start off the talk by kind of just showing you guys an example. And does anyone know right now what this example is?
JSON?
Who said JSON?
It's also Ruby.
Well, from this view, you could probably assume it's JSON, but I mean, if you're familiar with JavaScript, the whole property to value thing wouldn't be foreign, and that looks like an array, right? We have the open, whatever it was, I forgot the name, and then you have the brackets, right? That should be an object, and that object now has these properties. But does anyone know what this JSON document is doing, or what's it trying to tell us? Anyone? Well, I mean, based off this, let's say I made a URL request, right? And this is what returned to me, this JSON representation of a resource. Now what about this representation tells me what it is, what I can possibly do with it, or where I can go from here? Is there anything about this that says that? No, not at all.
It's not self-described.
Nope. And this is pretty common to have no context really in what we're getting back, just the results. And how would we even have gotten this result? I mean, there's an ID key, and then an author key, and a title key, and a content key. So like we can make an inference on this could be like, maybe like a tweet or like a blog post, but nothing's telling us from around this area how we can even interact with this representation. So right off the bat, that's ugly to me. And what you'll end up probably have to guess is like, okay, what was the URL that you sent in to even get this back? And let's say, in this case, it was something like mywebsite.com/posts. And now because of the URL, we can assume that it's posts is the representation, is what we're getting back, is a list of posts. But that's still not that clear. I mean, we're relying completely on the URL for context at the moment. And the URL can be anything. A URL can uniquely identify any resource. So it could be BizBuzz, and I get this back. Now, that has no context anymore. And then you might propose, okay, well, we'll provide lots of documentation describing how our URLs will interact with our routes, the controllers, they interact with our business processes, and they should know by reading the documentation that this is what they should get back, and this relates to posts, which is wrong. Because you don't want your API to solely rely on human readable documentation. That is not scalable, especially when we start getting into what Hypermedia APIs are. Now, a Hypermedia API starts to solve these problems. It starts to give us more context of this representation. And as we go through the presentation, I'm going to give you some concrete examples on what is a Hypermedia API, how it works, and then again that implementation part. So, first question would be, what are Hypermedia APIs? Well, I kind of broke it down for myself, hopefully for you, that Hypermedia APIs are RESTful. And now we're not going to be covering REST in this talk, because I'm assuming a lot of the advanced users would know about REST and its architecture. But Hypermedia APIs are RESTful. They're completely RESTful. And it's a translation of what people have seen the term REST or RESTful been bloated or fluffed up to mean things it doesn't necessarily mean. So people like Steve Black and a couple of like notable people from the community have said, okay, we're going to sidestep this whole RESTful REST term and propose a new term to describe our APIs, and that's Hypermedia. And that embodies what REST is, and it takes the implementation of how a RESTful API should be. Now, then the next part for me is that Hypermedia APIs are scalable. So now with REST, that's kind of like implicit that it would be scalable, but we've seen REST-like APIs become not scalable because it relies too much on documentation to give us context. So with these 3 bullet points, I kind of say that Hypermedia APIs are relatively easy to change and are extendable. And the reason that is because before in our bad example, we showed something that had no context or structure to it. I mean, those keys that we had, I mean, sure, they said to us, ID, author, and content, and title, but our client application has no idea what that means. It means nothing to it. That representation I showed meant nothing to the client app. So Hypermedia's APIs start to add in these specs that we'll be covering that help make things more extendable by giving you a set of design rules to apply to and constraints when sending back your representation. Now, that explains the extendability, but these other 2 bullet points here, I'm going to cover the last one and then jump back up to the middle one. Because versioning is kind of like a controversial subject with Hypermedia APIs, but encapsulation between the client and server, to me, that would communicate that I don't have to be handcrafting API calls now based off documentation that someone wrote up that may or may not lie to me, and make those calls myself based off whatever information I got from that poor representation. So an example of that would be that representation gave me a list of posts possibly, and how would I find that post from there? What about that list told me how to get to the exact post resource? It didn't say that. So I'd probably say, okay, maybe I should take the ID, the documentation says that. Okay, so I take the ID and I handcraft this API call, and now I send that out, and it comes back, and okay, so it looks to be the resource that was related to that. But there's no way of getting there when we made our first request. So that becomes the encapsulation, is that our server is now giving us a described relation and associations of resources and actions that you can have on a given resource representation. And now, just to clarify, a resource representation is something like JSON or HTML that gets interpreted back, right guys? So that's what I mean by that. And so finally I come to the last one, which was the middle one, for anyone who's keeping track, is Hypermedia APIs trying to eliminate a need for versioning. Now, how many people version their APIs? Right? Because a lot of us have to, because usually when it comes to breaking compatibility, you will probably end up having to version to alleviate some of the code. So Hypermedia APIs, and I say try here because it really, they're trying, is trying to help bridge the semantic gap of not needing always to version out, but have an understanding of features and what features to pay attention to by programming your client app to understand those, and what features not to pay attention to because they don't need to care. And I'll kind of show that with the diagram, is that I make a request, and by resource I mean the representation, but we get this representation of this resource back, and from there, that could be HTML, JSON, XML, pretty much any document markup language that supports Hypermedia. And from there, you could almost consider this like, if this was an HTML page, and I just requested the root of a site, like Facebook, now Facebook comes back with its representation of the root of the URL, whether that's the login page for people who aren't signed in, or the profile page for people who are, that would be the representation. And from there, I'm able to click on these links like my friends and go down to this comment. I'm not typing in the URL to find someone's like on a post. I'm searching around, I'm discovering things. And that's where this Hypermedias are discoverable comes in, where when I have a representation of a resource come back to me and it says, okay, you got your title, you got your author, you got your content. Oh yeah, and this is related to this resource. This is the link to get to that post. So in that list view, we might have had those 3 objects, and also a link to get to those individual resources. So now when we get that request back, we can discover new resources related to that list. And that's important in Hypermedia because it provides us context of each thing. We get a list back. A list of what? Well, it can be defined in the structure of a Hypermedia, which we'll get to. But more importantly, we'll also understand the context of what is associated, an associated action, an associated resource. So if you wanted to make a call for, let's say, adding a new comment onto the post list, you wouldn't have to read the documentation to get there. You would have a given link or association to describe that. So imagine that, well, actually don't imagine, I'll get to that. No imagination. So how do they work? And so if you guys have been trying to follow along, I mean, it's kind of a lot to just shove down some people's throats, especially mine, is how do they work? Because this is all really nice in theory. Like, oh, it's scalability, it works like the web. You've got these anchor tags, and follow the anchor tags, and it comes back. But how does that kind of work? Like, how can we be sure that we're not just programming each of our clients the same way we're doing it now with all the application semantics? Well, a first step, which is probably the most important step, into how it works is with a media type. Now, who knows what a media type is? Show of hands. What's your favorite media type? Okay, no one's volunteering. All right. So, what was it?
Animated GIF.
Okay, there you go.
Text/plain.
Text/plain. So those are media types. Text/plain, image/JPEG, application/JSON. Those are all media types describing how, well, describing in a specification how they work and how we use them. So text/HTML is a pretty popular one, right? I mean, I hear it's used, but that has specifications on how the markup language works, right? So, and that gives us context on what a link is. When we say an anchor tag, we mean it's a link to another resource, and our browser knows how to follow that link. So with a media type specification to format our JSON returns, or in this case XML returns, we're able to give that context for our client app. So in this case, I'm using Maze plus XML. And what this does is give us a standardized media type with a list of specifications on how this media type works. And us, let's say we're the client end developers, knowing that this is how the server is going to send us back our representations, we'll code up our client to understand the media type. Now that's not the same as coding it up for the application semantics of it. That's coding it up to understand the formatting and the structure. And that gives us the context of how to interpret this. So in this case, we see that this maze, right, comes back and it's on version 1. And the specification probably states what version really means and what the value could be. But more importantly, we see that in a maze, we have a cell. Now, what does a cell really mean to anyone? When we're, as a human, if I'm reading this, I'm like, a cell doesn't mean anything to me. Maybe it means it's part of the maze. The only educated guess I could say is it's a cell above the maze, because it's inside the maze tag, and that's pretty much it. And so that's what your client would say if you didn't have a media type. It'd be like, well, what are you giving me right now? Just XML with weird tags. With the media type, we're able to define what this cell tag is, what this relation attribute means with the cell tag, and that gives it the context. So rel equals current means that that's the current cell of the maze that we're in right now. So if we're traversing through a maze, right, as a computer or human, we're told that, okay, my client app is going to understand that that's the current cell we're in the maze. And then from that cell, we have hypermedia, the first signs of it right here, these link tags. Now, they're telling me that the href of these are to these places, but that doesn't really say much about the maze itself, of how it's a 2D maze. Can I go up, down, left, right? Well, the media type tells us that if we use east or west, in the 2D maze, we'll be going east or west. And so now our client app doesn't have to be programmed to understand the application semantics of east or west. It's told by the media type how to implement that. And so now we can go, let's say, east to cells n, and now cells n will be its own resource like this, and at least have a link back to m, because that's the associated resource to it. Now, another part about having these Hypermedia APIs is really just comes down to respecting HTTP and what it gives you. So if I'm losing anyone, just a show of hands, please. Okay. So I don't know if there's anything I can do about that besides offer like Q&A afterwards. But try to imagine it as we're trying to build an API that is scalable like the web. But that's like a very base idea that you can hear. And this has nothing to do with the slide, just so you know. But it's scalable because of the web. And the web knows how to interpret links and follow links and so on. When we get a new website that we discover, we don't need to upgrade our browser to understand how to use the website. Our client browser, like Chrome, understands how to do that already. So with a Hypermedia API, we're trying to bridge that gap, like how HTML has done, by offering media types. And media types are kind of taking the place of how we structure our responses in our API. And then from there, we get something like links to follow other resources. So that's just a quick summary of what I said over 4 slides. Meaningful descriptions again. So our client makes a post request, and it's to the URI/post, and we state the host of our website is it's microblog, but just, I don't know, Germanized. And we say an accepted header in there. Now that's important because we're probably normal to seeing something like application/JSON as the media type that we send back and forth between a JSON API. Well, when we state the accepted header in the HTTP call, we're saying that we only accept this media type back. And if our server doesn't give us this media type back, I don't care, because this is what I'm demanding at this point. So that could have been application/maze plus XML. It could be a couple of other media types, but that's what we're asking for. So now we're expecting that constraint to be added to our response. And then below here we have our server letting us know a proper status code, a 201. So we posted something, which is creating in this case. And so we should get that our resource was created, not just a 200 to let us know that it was a success, but a 201 to explain what action we just took. And then from there, we can also even add in a location header, which depending on the status code will forward you to the resource. And now you have this way of jumping to the resource. And then we also let it know that the content type that it's returning is going to be application/how plus JSON, which is important because those two things sync up at this point. And now the server understands what media type it's using, and the client understands what media type to expect. Okay. So the syntax highlighting isn't that great on here. But the idea is that this is now another JSON request. What's different about this one than the last ones that we saw? Besides that, it's not in a list format. This is the specific resource. But what's different about this one?
It has links.
It has links. Gold star. So it has links, and what does links mean to us? What does that even mean? Again, it doesn't mean anything to probably you or the client app yet until you introduce a media type to describe what links are. Now, the media type specifies that the key links is going to hold an array of objects. And those array of objects are expected to be actual links. So you can see here, we use rel again to state the relation of the link. So for this resource post, there's the ID of 4, and it has all the content that we expected. But now we have an href or URI telling us how to get that resource again if we needed to. So then it's discoverable at that point. We understand how we can get here again without having to handcraft the API call. We also have an author and a post link. Now, this is a pretty small example, and anyone who's familiar with Hypermedia APIs could have been like, well, you could have gotten much farther than this. Could add a bunch of that extra stuff. But for the sake of everyone that's getting used to it, this is the Hypermedia. This is what makes a Hypermedia API, is these links to other resources and it provides us a way to discovering other resources just like we would on the web. And to understand how this would work, you would use the JSON keys to map out that URI. So now you're not relying on hard coding the URL, you're relying on these keys that are specified by the media type. So the media type changing is going to be through some standards and bodies of people that are going to say, okay, what's this new update of this media type in? But if we already understand the media type, and more APIs are building APIs off of this media type, we already have a fair amount of knowledge of how these APIs are being built, and it's not so different anymore. They're more conventionalized. Now, you guys use Rails, right? Yes, you do, okay. And you guys like convention over configuration if you like Rails, right? Yes, you do. And what a media type you could consider is doing here is adding convention over the configuration of your response. It's providing constraints for how you can interpret it on the client side each time. So links will always mean it maps to an array of objects that are links. So now we can actually get to an implementation here. So in this case, we're using the gems roar and roar-rails, which you will put in your gem file and you'll bundle install. And since we, in this presentation, are using Rails, we can use a Rails generator to generate a representer and then a post. Now, what a representer is going to be doing is taking the context of what the controller would normally pass on to the view, and that gets passed on to this representer. It's basically kind of like a middleman that's going to say, okay, well, we want to respond with JSON, right? In your controller, you would say respond with JSON for this object. And then that gets passed not to the view in this case, but to this representer that will format that JSON request to be a Hypermedia API representation. So what we saw before is that it had an ID, had a title, an author, content, and then this is how you would set up links inside of your representations. You would have these link do's that say, describing what the link name is going to be, the relation, and then you can even use Rails URL helpers to create the links inside of there. And those get embedded into the document. And now it's a Hypermedia response. Now, the way your controller would look is that you include, oh gosh, that's awful, sorry guys. You would include the roars module for Rails helpers, and ignore the respond to JSON part. But you would have a method like show, and post equals post by ID and grant ID. And then you would have this new way of saying respond with, instead of respond, it's respond with post. And from this moment, it's going to take that object post, throw it over to representer. Representer gets the context of the view and how to interact with it, knows what URLs are related to it at that point, and then it sends it back to us. And then we get something just like we had as an example. So that was fairly easy. We added a couple of gems. We added a representer module, or even a class if you wanted, to basically be the middleman of how to format your JSON request. Now, who's interested in Hypermedia APIs just off the bat? Cool. How much of this is making sense to those who are interested in this, or even not interested? How much of this is making sense of why this is valuable?
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So is it safe to say that essentially like you're just returning your endpoints rather than delivering it as static documentation outside of the response?
Right.
So that's what's allowing you to change your endpoints without breaking anything?
Right. So it allows, like Fred just said, it allows you to change how your endpoints are architected, because in reality, you shouldn't care so much about the URL itself to form the architecture of your API. In this way, it allows you to discover endpoints through JSON keys, or XML tags, or some other type of markup. And that way, the client app is using JSON keys to map out this URI instead of the actual URI. So when I update my API to say, okay, well now it's not author slash the username, it's going to be users / the username, that shouldn't break.
Right.
That should still follow it correctly.
Is that kind of like a key takeaway from Hypermedia versus REST, standard REST API?
Well, so you said standard REST, which makes me want to respond in a couple of different ways. But
Well, let's say the Rails API.
okay, so the main difference I would say for Rails API, even though I have a shallow understanding of Rails, is that Rails gives you the HTTP verbs, right? And it gives you the routes file to map your verbs and your controller and controller action, right, to a URL. Now that works because you're using the HTTP verbs to decide how to do CRUD, right? But what it doesn't really do in the case of a JSON API is tell you how this actually relates to other resources. So on a website, if I look to your profile, I can see your posts, I can see your images and stuff like that. But if it was in an API, in like a typical REST-like one, it probably wouldn't have the hypermedia embedded to it.
You can't like intuit other things about the object.
Right, like you don't understand, how can I go from this profile to these things? You're just requesting the status of the profile, let's say, the representation, and then you have to make another API call, is what typically happens. And then you'll read the documentation on how to structure your URL, which is nonsense. And so with the Hypermedia API, you wouldn't have to worry about crafting that URL API call. You'd just be given the endpoint based off the business process of the API. So when the API developers are designing this out, they'll be like, okay, well, what should be within the post? Well, we got all the default stuff. Well, what can we discover from here? So these are just small examples, like finding out what the author is and going to his resource. But you could add in comments. You can add an array of comments that map by ID to certain comments. But you could pretty much relay any resource to what this representation could have, or even just another URI that points to it so you can grab it. And that way you understand the context of what this kind of is and what it can do and what's associated with it. Otherwise, you're given nothing. And you probably have, at the beginning of the presentation, something like that, which is very obscure. There's nothing telling me what ID, author, title, content really means in the sense of like, what are those links? I don't know, my client app doesn't know. But with the media type introduced, it provides that constraint and those conventions to it to where links now means it's gonna represent links, and my other types of keys are part of the application, and that's pretty much it. Like, does that kind of make sense? Brett says yes.
Well, doesn't the consumer, the API, still have to know something about what's going to be located at that
You mean like
place
if
in
we
order
have
to
like the
be able
media type of it?
to do anything meaningful with it?
No, I think what he's getting at is my question as well. I get what this is giving you, a way to have something that could be human readable as well as computer crawlable.
Right.
However, an API is consumed by a client, whether that's an HTML JavaScript app or whether that's an iPhone app or something, it's
Sure.
consuming this. I can't just craft an app, whether a JavaScript app or an iPhone app, and say, as part of my configuration, here's a URL to this Hypermedia API. Now I'm going to build an application that knows nothing about what's at the other end of this. It's going to discover it all and have it actually be of any kind of use or aesthetic usability, because I need to know that what I'm building an app for is to display posts and that I'm going to display it in a certain format. And
Right.
so if I already need to know that, then having my thing be able to know just by the data what URL to grab next if I want to list,
Sure.
I don't see much difference between that and just reading the docs.
Well, see, the thing is that when you rely solely on human readable documentation, it at a point, REST is supposed to point out that you want hypermedia in your documents, right? And that's how web scale is by having hypermedia in your documents so you can correctly understand the representation. So what a hypermedia API is trying to do is give you that same type of hypermedia if you want to program use for those things, right? But you're not solely relying on handwritten documentation to make API calls to your endpoints. So to kind of capitalize on what you asked was, The reason why it's different is because now you're adding in a whole new idea that APIs don't have right now. And that's this convention and constraint that when I write an API using this media type, it's going to be close to the same semantics of writing an API with the same media type.
We should be wrapping this up pretty soon.
Yeah.
So one question, since we have to wrap it up pretty soon, and I'll let you continue with your talk. And that is, does it make sense then to take it a step farther that hypermedia APIs, because they do use a media type, and that's what you base it off of, are really only useful if multiple providers are going to be using the same media type to provide an API?
Yes. In a short answer, yes. But that's because of a couple of things. It's because there's not really a standards body at this given time. Like, so the truth about it is that you'll see a lot of people huff and puff about hypermedia APIs, such as myself, and kind of introduce it to people and say, okay, try out this media type. This is already a standard, it's already got specs. But what I'm trying to get to the point here is that this provides an API that's discoverable and has some scale to it, but in the sense that if no one else is using the same media type and we're all doing different things, it kind of becomes much harder to standardize things in the sense of a media type when everyone else is doing things differently. But I would strongly agree that you should check it out, which I wasn't thinking you were not going to do, and look into how to build a Hypermedia API and see the real benefits for yourself. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And my next slide was any questions, which we kind of accomplished.
Yeah. All right, thank you.